Just 3 days after my open heart surgery, my daughter-in-law walked into my hospital room. She held papers. "Sign these," she said. "We need this vacation." The papers would have signed my entire life savings over to them. I simply smiled. When she went to the bank on Monday to file them, she discovered she and my son would have to live on the streets. I'm glad you're here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from so I can see how far my story has reached. The light in the hospital room was almost blinding, sharp, sterile, and far too clean. The kind of brightness that made the place feel more like a laboratory than a place meant for healing. The faint, antiseptic smell lingered in the air, trying but failing to mask the undertone of sickness. I shifted slightly against the stiff, overstarched pillows, wincing as a dull wave of pain rippled across my chest. It had been 3 days since my open heart surgery, and even the smallest movement reminded me just how fragile my body felt now. My thoughts were still sluggish, wrapped in the haze of lingering anesthesia, but I was alert enough to register the voice of the nurse as she appeared in the doorway. "Mom, you have a visitor," she said cheerfully, stepping aside. And there she was, Amara, my daughter-in-law. Perfectly styled as always, her sleek hair framing a face painted with careful precision. Her manicured nails clutched a designer handbag as she gave me that familiar smile. The one I had seen for 7 years now, ever since she married my son, Keith. It was a smile that looked warm at first glance but never touched her eyes. A mask polished and practiced. "Velma, look at you, sitting up already," she said, her voice dripping with honeyed sweetness as she swept into the room. The scent of her expensive perfume quickly overpowered the hospital's antiseptic odor, making the air feel heavier. "We've all been so worried." I managed a weak nod as she set a small bouquet on the side table. It was from the hospital gift shop, cheap, generic, impersonal. She might have thought I wouldn't notice, but I did. Keith was nowhere to be seen. "Where's my son?" I asked, my voice still hoarse from the breathing tube they'd taken out just the day before. "Oh, he's swamped at work. You know how it is," she said with a casual wave, settling gracefully into the visitor's chair. "But he sends his love." I doubted it. Keith hadn't visited me once since the surgery. The same boy who used to call probably every single day now existed only in the excuses Amara delivered on his behalf. Then she got to the real reason she was here. "I actually brought something that needs your attention," she said, reaching into her purse and pulling out a manila envelope. "Just some papers that need signing." My eyes narrowed slightly. "Papers?" "Nothing major," she assured me quickly, though her smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Keith and I are planning a family vacation to Hawaii, and we need to finalize the financing. The bank requires your signature since you're still listed as a co-owner on a few accounts." She slid the papers onto my lap and leaned forward, pointing to highlighted lines. "Just sign here, here, and here. It's mostly formalities." I reached for the pen she offered, my hand trembling slightly, not from weakness, but from anger. Did she really think I wouldn't see what these documents were? They weren't travel forms. They were transfer of property deeds, power of attorney forms, and legal documents that would hand my home, my sanctuary of 45 years, over to them without question. "Hawaii sounds lovely," I said softly, my eyes on the papers. "When are you planning to go?" "Next month," she replied quickly, her gaze fixed on the pen in my hand. "We thought it would be good to get away after everything." Her eyes flicked toward my chest, where the edge of my surgical scar peeked above the hospital gown. "And Keith approved this?" I asked, watching her closely. "Of course," she said. For the briefest moment, irritation crossed her face before she smoothed it away. "He's the one who told me to bring them. Said you wouldn't mind us." I bet he did. My own son, once gentle, thoughtful, and full of kindness, now reduced to sending his wife to manipulate his mother when she was at her weakest. The ache in my chest in that moment had nothing to do with my surgery. Still, I signed. One paper, then the next, then the last. My signature wavered, but it was clear enough. I watched as her smile widened with each stroke of my pen, finally genuine, but genuine in greed. "Thank you, Velma," she said quickly, sweeping the papers into the envelope as if she were afraid I might change my mind. "This means so much to us. I'll take care of everything with the bank right away." I gave her a small, knowing smile. one she mistook for the weary expression of a frail old woman who didn't understand what she'd just done. "You get some rest now," she added, patting my hand in a condescending way. "I'll tell Keith you're doing well." I leaned back against the pillows and closed my eyes as she strutted out, clutching her precious envelope like a prize. If only she knew. If only she knew that 3 months ago I had already placed my home into a protected trust, that every account she thought she was about to control had been emptied and closed weeks before, that the papers she was so eager to file would lead her only to embarrassment, and the realization that she and Keith would soon have nowhere to live. I wasn't blind. I'd seen the way they looked at my house when they thought I wasn't watching, overheard their whispers about when mom's gone and what they'd do with my things. I'd noticed how visits with my grandchildren had stopped, unless they wanted something. The pain in my chest grew sharper, but not from the incision. It was the sting of betrayal. The heartbreak of realizing that my only son, the little boy I'd raised alone after his father died, the child I had worked myself to the bone to provide for, had become someone I barely recognized. But I wasn't going to let them win. Not this time. Monday would come soon enough. And with it, the moment Amara would discover what happens when you underestimate a 70-year-old woman who has had enough. I let the steady beeping of the heart monitor lull me toward a restless sleep, imagining the look on her face when her carefully constructed house of cards finally collapsed. When did Keith change? That question haunted me as I lay in that bed, counting the hours until Monday. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment my son transformed from the boy who used to rush home to tell me about his day into the man who would send his wife to deceive me while I was recovering from surgery. I thought back to when he was little, how he'd come running to me with a fistful of dandelions, his smile beaming with pride as though he'd found treasure. Those simple flowers had meant more to me than any bouquet Amara could ever bring. Robert, my husband, had died when Keith was only 8. A sudden heart attack. Cruel irony, given that the same condition had landed me here. From that moment on, it was just Keith and me against the world. I had worked 2 jobs, receptionist during the day, waitress at night, anything to keep our modest home and put food on the table. Every sacrifice had been for him. And now here I was, realizing that all along he had been drifting away into someone I never thought he'd become. "Mom, you don't have to work so hard," Keith had told me one night when he was 15. He had walked into the kitchen to find me hunched over the table, tears sliding down my cheeks as I stared at a pile of overdue bills. "I can get a job after school," he offered, his voice quiet but steady. "Absolutely not," I told him firmly, shaking my head. "Your job is to focus on school, get into college. That's what your father would have wanted." And Keith did exactly that. He worked hard, earned a scholarship to the state university, and became the first in our family to graduate from college. I had pulled extra shifts for months just so I could buy him a decent suit for job interviews. The day he called to tell me he'd landed his first position at an accounting firm, I don't think I'd ever been prouder. "This is just the beginning, Mom," he said, hugging me tight. "Someday I'll take care of you, the way you've always taken care about me." And for a few years, he truly did. He'd come over for Sunday dinners, call just to see how I was doing, help me with yard work and repairs around the house. Keith was everything a mother could hope for in a son. Then he met Amara. I remember the first time he brought her home. Her eyes scanned my modest living room with quiet judgment, lingering on my worn sofa and the outdated decorations. I had spent hours cleaning every corner of the house, cooking Keith's favorite pot roast, determined to make a good impression. "Quaint," she finally said, the word dripping with condescension as she picked at her food. Keith didn't seem to notice. He was too busy gazing at her beauty, her poise, her air of ambition. I suppose that's what drew him in. Amara knew exactly what she wanted and how to get it. After years of struggle, maybe Keith saw her as his ticket to the life he thought he deserved. They married quickly. The ceremony was lavish, far beyond anything I could afford to contribute to. Amara's parents covered most of the expenses, and she never let me forget it. The wedding felt like it was all about appearances, extravagant flower arrangements, food so gourmet I couldn't even pronounce the names, and a guest list full of strangers to me. A week before the big day, Keith had asked, Mom, could you maybe wear something a little more modern? Amara thinks the dress you showed her is a bit outdated. That was the first time I saw it. That shadow pass over his face. Embarrassment. My son was embarrassed by me. After the wedding, the change came quickly. The visits grew fewer, the phone calls shorter. When they did come by, Amara would make little comments, her tone light but cutting. But this neighborhood has really gone downhill, hasn't it? Have you thought about updating your kitchen? Those cabinets are so retro. Keith and I saw the most beautiful retirement communities on the way here, perfect for someone in your situation. Each remark was like a paper cut, small but adding up until I felt raw and bruised inside. Keith never defended me. Worse, he began to echo her opinions, as if the home where I'd raised him, the same home that had carried us through grief after his father died, had suddenly become inadequate. 3 years into their marriage, Keith and Amara ran into financial trouble. They had bought a house far beyond their means, desperate to keep up with their friends in wealthier neighborhoods. It's just a temporary loan, Mom, Keith said when they asked for $30,000 from my modest savings, money I'd put aside for medical expenses in my old age. We'll pay you back with interest. I gave it to them. They never repaid a cent. Then came the grandchildren, twin boys I rarely saw. When they did visit, Amara hovered protectively, her voice sharp. "Don't touch that, Hunter. We don't know when it was last cleaned," she'd say loudly enough for me to hear from the kitchen. The final blow came last year. I had stepped outside to water my garden while they were visiting, and their voices drifted through the open window. "How much longer do you think she can live here alone?" Amara asked. "I don't know," Keith replied. "Her health isn't great. Maybe another year or two. This house would sell for a good price, even with the outdated interior. We could finally move near the Mitchells." "Mom would never sell," he added. "She might not have a choice if her health declines," Amara pressed. "As her only son, you'd have power of attorney. We could make decisions in her best interest." There was a pause, a chance for my son to shut this down, to defend me. Instead, he said, "You're right. We should talk to a lawyer about our options." That night after they left, I sat alone in my living room, surrounded by decades of memories, and cried for the first time since Robert's funeral. The betrayal cut deeper than any physical wound I'd ever known. The next morning, I made an appointment with my own lawyer. Now, lying in this hospital bed, watching the sunset paint shadows across the sterile white walls, I felt an odd mixture of grief and grim satisfaction. Monday was coming, and with it, the consequences of underestimating an old woman who had survived far worse than a scheming daughter-in-law. I closed my eyes and pictured Amara's face when she realized all her careful planning had been for nothing. It wasn't joy I felt, just a weary acceptance that sometimes love means protecting yourself from the very people who should have been your protectors. The doctor discharged me on Sunday afternoon, a day earlier than expected. I told them I could manage on my own, ignoring their concerned looks. The truth was, I didn't want Keith or Amara driving me home. I couldn't bear to see that glint in Amara's eyes as she walked through my house, mentally cataloging my belongings like she was at an estate sale. Instead, I called Dorothy, my neighbor for over 30 years, one of the few people I still trusted completely. "Those ungrateful vultures," Dorothy muttered as she helped me settle into my recliner in the living room. "After everything you've done for that boy." I gave her a faint smile. Dorothy had watched Keith's transformation over the years, sitting on her porch as his visits became shorter, less frequent. "You sure about tomorrow?" she asked, adjusting the pillows behind my back. "Absolutely," I said. "Amara will find out everything when the bank opens at 9. I want to be sitting right here in my own home when the storm hits." Dorothy nodded, her eyes full of understanding. "I'll be right next door if you need me. Just call." After she left, I sat alone as the daylight faded, the room slowly swallowed by shadow. My thoughts drifted back to the day I set my plan into motion 6 months ago, right after I overheard Keith and Amara whispering about taking my house. That conversation had seared itself into my memory, word for word, tone for tone, so sharp and vivid it might as well have happened yesterday. I waited patiently for the perfect day to act, one when I could be sure they wouldn't just pop in unannounced. Wednesdays were always safe. Amara never broke her spa day routine. On that Wednesday, I called a taxi to take me downtown to Harriet Wilson's law office. Harriet and I went way back, high school classmates who had drifted apart for decades until we reconnected at our fifth reunion. In the years between, she had built a thriving legal practice specializing in elder law, and not long ago she had helped another friend in a situation eerily similar to mine. When I arrived, she welcomed me with the same warm smile I remembered from our teenage years, ushering me into her office. "What brings you in today?" she asked. I drew a deep breath and told her everything. The changes I'd seen in Keith, the way Amara's polite veneer had been wearing thinner and thinner until her contempt was almost impossible to miss. And finally, the conversation I'd overheard about them planning to take my home. As I spoke, her friendly expression hardened into something far more focused, professional determination. "Unfortunately, I see this more often than you'd think," she said when I finished. "Adult children who think they're entitled to their parents' assets, often egged on by spouses who see nothing but dollar signs. But there are ways to protect yourself." And for the next 3 hours, Harriet laid out my lifeline. First, she helped me create an irrevocable trust for my house. We transferred the deed into the trust, with me as the lifetime beneficiary. It wasn't just a legal technicality. She included airtight provisions that would make it impossible for Keith or Amara to challenge the trust even after I was gone. Next, we closed the joint bank accounts I'd opened years ago to give Keith access in case of an emergency, accounts that now seemed like open invitations for him to meddle. Every penny from those accounts went into new ones at a different bank, completely in my name. "But what if they try to get me to sign something in Ohi?" I asked. Harriet's lips curved into a knowing smile. "Let them try. Anything you sign that attempts to transfer assets now in the trust will be legally worthless. You don't own the house anymore. The trust does. And the trust only answers to the law, not to them." Oddly enough, signing those papers didn't feel like losing something. It felt like taking something back. For the first time in years, I felt in control of my own life again. Before I left, Harriet added, "One more thing, you should be ready for their reaction. They won't take this well." I nodded, feeling a strange calm settle over me. "I know, but I've spent my whole life protecting Keith. Maybe it's time I started protecting myself." In the months that followed, I played my part flawlessly. I kept up the illusion that nothing had changed. I still hosted the occasional family dinner, still tolerated Amara's veiled jabs about my charming but outdated home, still endured Keith's increasingly transparent questions about my finances. At their last visit before my surgery, Keith asked, "Have you thought about what you'll do with this big house in the future, Mom?" "I'm doing just fine here," I told him, watching disappointment flicker across his face. "But it must be so much work," Amara chimed in sweetly. "Wouldn't it be easier to move somewhere smaller? We could help you look." I smiled and changed the subject, knowing their patience was wearing thin. I suspected they saw my upcoming heart surgery as the perfect opportunity, a moment of weakness when they could slip papers under my nose, papers they assumed I wouldn't read too carefully. Now, sitting in my living room and as the sunset spilled long shadows across the hardwood floor, I felt an odd sort of peace. Tomorrow would bring chaos, but tonight I savored the satisfaction of having outmaneuvered them on their own battlefield. My phone rang, snapping me from my thoughts. Keith's name flashed on the screen. "Mom," he said, sounding genuinely surprised when I picked up. "You're home? Why didn't you call us to pick you up?" "Dorothy helped me," I replied simply. "You should have called." "We'd have been happy to drive you," he insisted, his voice dripping with manufactured concern. I almost laughed. "It's fine, Keith. I'm settled in now." "Well, Amara and I will stop by tomorrow morning to check on you," he said. "She has some paperwork to drop off at the bank anyway, so we'll be in the area." Of course they would. They wouldn't want to miss the chance to watch me struggle up the stairs, evidence for their ongoing case that I couldn't handle living here anymore. "That would be lovely," I lied. "I'll see you both tomorrow." As I hung up, a smile tugged at my lips. They had no idea what awaited them. Amara would walk into that bank tomorrow, papers in hand, expecting to claim what she thought was hers, only to find out there was nothing left to take. I made myself a cup of tea, settled into my recliner, and mentally prepared for tomorrow's confrontation. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a victim. I felt like a woman who had finally taken her power back. The house was quiet except for the steady ticking of the grandfather clock Robert had loved so much. I imagined him here beside me, perhaps smiling with approval. He'd always told me I was stronger than I gave myself credit for. Tomorrow, everyone else would find out he'd been right. Monday morning arrived, golden light spilling through the kitchen windows. Even with the dull ache from my surgery, I got up early, determined to face the day my way. I made a light breakfast, took my medication, and curled up in my favorite armchair with a book I'd been meaning to read for months. Right on cue, just as the grandfather clock chimed 9, a car door slammed outside. I took a deep breath and braced myself. The doorbell rang, immediately followed by the rattle of a key in the lock. They didn't even wait for me to answer. "Mom?" Keith's voice called, echoing through the hallway. "Where are you?" "In the living room," I said evenly, not bothering to rise. Keith stepped in, crisp in his business suit, and behind him came Amara, dressed as though she were on her way to a fashion magazine photo shoot. Her smile was as practiced as ever. "How are you feeling?" Keith asked, leaning down to kiss my cheek. The gesture felt hollow, purely for show. "As well as can be expected after open-heart surgery," I replied. "You really should have called us to bring you home," Amara said, placing her designer purse on the coffee table. "Keith was quite upset when he found out you'd been discharged." I highly doubted that. "Dorothy was happy to help," I said simply. Keith glanced at his watch. "Listen, Mom, Amara needs to run to the bank to file those papers you signed. I thought I'd stay here and Keith was here to help me out for a bit." How convenient. His presence would keep me occupied, no doubt, while Amara took care of whatever paperwork she had suddenly decided couldn't wait another minute. Part of me wondered, had they already started imagining how they'd redecorate my home once it was theirs, picking out paint swatches in their minds, deciding which of my things would be tossed, which rooms would be gutted. "That's fine," I told them, keeping my voice light. "Amara, there's fresh coffee in the kitchen if you'd like a cup before you go." Her smile tightened just enough to betray her impatience. "Actually, I should get to the bank before it gets busy. I won't be long." She gave Keith a loaded look, a look that said more than words could, before heading toward the door. A moment later, the sound of it closing echoed through the quiet house, leaving just Keith and me. "Can I get you anything, Mom?" he asked, lingering awkwardly near the coffee table. "Tea? More pillows?" "I'm fine, Keith," I said, my eyes resting on the face of the man who used to be my sweet boy. "Why don't you sit down? We haven't had a real conversation in quite some time." He lowered himself onto the very edge of the sofa cushion, as if he might need to spring up at any second. "The doctor said your surgery went well. No complications?" "None," I confirmed. "I should make a full recovery." "That's great news." He smiled, but it was the kind of smile that stopped at the mouth, never quite reaching the eyes. "We were worried." "Were you?" I asked quietly. The question caught him off guard. I saw it in the way he shifted in his seat, like the truth had just jabbed him in the ribs. "Of course we were. You're my mother." I let the silence settle thick between us, watching as he began to fidget under the weight of it. In the past, I would have rushed in to fill that silence, to rescue him from discomfort. Not today. Finally, he cleared his throat. "So, have you thought any more about what we talked about before your surgery? About possibly downsizing? This house is a lot for you to manage." And there it was, barely 15 minutes in the door, and we'd arrived at the real reason for his visit. "Actually," I began, but was cut off by the sound of the front door flying open. Amara stormed into the living room, her cheeks flushed and eyes blazing. "What did you do?" she demanded, her voice sharp enough to slice through the air. Keith shot to his feet, startled. "Amara, what's wrong?" "Ask your mother," she snapped, tossing her purse onto the sofa with a thud. "Go ahead, Velma. Tell him what the bank just told me." I set my book aside and met her fury head on. "I assume they informed you that the house is no longer in my name." Keith's face shifted from confusion to alarm. "What? What does that mean?" "It means," I said evenly, "that 6 months ago I transferred ownership of this house into an irrevocable trust. The papers Amara had me sign in the hospital? They're worthless." "You tricked us?" Amara's voice pitched upward, teetering on a shriek. "No, Amara, you tried to trick me. I simply protected myself." Keith's skin had gone pale. Mom, what are you talking about? Those papers were for our vacation. I looked straight at my son, my sadness mixing with a steel-edged resolve. Keith, please don't insult my intelligence. Those papers would have transferred my house to you and Amara. I'm recovering from surgery, not suffering from dementia. This is ridiculous, Amara hissed. You can't just, I can and I did. I cut in sharply, and that's not all. The joint accounts you had access to, closed. All the money has been moved to new accounts, ones only I can touch. Amara's head whipped toward Keith. Did you know about this? Did you? Of course not. Keith dragged a hand through his hair, the desperation creeping into his voice. Mom, you need to undo this. We're family. This isn't right. Family? I repeated, the word tasting bitter. Is that what we are? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you and Amara have just been biding your time, waiting for the right moment to take everything I've worked for. That's not true, Keith said, but even he sounded unconvinced. I heard you, I said quietly. Last year, through the open window, I heard you telling Amara how you could get power of attorney over me and force me to sell my house. Keith's face crumpled, guilt spreading across his features. He didn't bother to deny it. You had no right, Amara snapped, her voice sharp with a dangerous edge. We have been planning for years. Amara, stop, Keith warned. Too late. Planning what exactly, I asked, though we all knew the answer. Her carefully constructed mask slipped entirely, revealing the cold, calculating woman underneath. This house is wasted on you. Do you have any idea what we could get for it in this market? And instead, you're sitting here alone, hogging all this space while Keith and I are drowning in our mortgage. Drowning? I arched a brow. Is that what you call it when you take 3 luxury vacations a year? When you drive a car worth more than most people make annually? When you remodel your kitchen because the appliances, 2 years old, aren't trendy enough anymore? Keith sagged back into the sofa, his head dropping into his hands. Mom, please. We can work this out. There's nothing to work out, I said firmly. The trust is irrevocable. No one can touch this house but me. Amara's hands trembled as she snatched her purse. This isn't over. We'll fight this. We'll get lawyers. Feel free, I replied coolly. You remember Harriet Wilson from my high school reunion, Keith? She made sure everything was legally airtight. But by all means, waste your money. You'll regret this, Amara spat, storming toward the door. Keith, we're leaving. He hesitated, torn between his wife's fury and the reality of what they'd been caught doing. Keith, Amara barked. Slowly he rose, looking at me with a mixture of shame and stubborn anger. We just wanted to help you, Mom. You're twisting everything. The disappointment in me was bone deep. Even now, I thought, he can't admit the truth. I think you should go, I said quietly. This isn't over, Amara called over her shoulder as she marched out. Keith lingered another moment. Just go, Keith, I said, suddenly feeling every one of my 70 years. I'm tired. When they were gone, silence crept back in. I should have felt victorious. Instead, an ache spread through me. Yes, I had protected my home, but I had lost my son in the process. Or maybe, if I was being honest, I'd lost him long ago. The days that followed their dramatic exit were eerily still. I braced myself for angry phone calls, legal threats, perhaps another surprise visit. None came. The silence settled in like a heavy wool blanket, suffocating but impenetrable. Dorothy stopped by daily, bringing soup and a listening ear. Heard anything? She'd ask, pretending at nonchalance. Not a word, I'd answer just as casually. But we both knew it wasn't peace, it was the stillness before a storm. That storm arrived on Thursday. It was a quiet afternoon, nearly a week after the confrontation. I was in the garden, finding peace in the rhythmic, grounding work of pulling weeds and trimming the roses. The air was warm, fragrant with the scent of soil and blooms, when a car I didn't recognize rolled slowly into my driveway. A woman stepped out, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement. She was dressed in a crisp, perfectly tailored business suit, a leather portfolio tucked neatly under one arm. Her hair was smooth, her expression brisk and professional. Miss Velma Harrington, she called, walking toward me. I straightened, careful not to strain my still-healing chest. Yes? I'm Jessica Moore from Lawson and Associates. She extended a polished business card. I represent your son and his wife in a legal matter concerning your property. Of course, so they had actually gone through with it, just as Amara had threatened. They had found someone willing to take their money and fight their fight. I'm recovering from heart surgery, I said evenly, wiping my soil-stained hands on my gardening gloves. If you have legal documents, you can leave them here. I'll have my attorney review them. Her brows twitched, just slightly, as if she'd been expecting something else. Maybe she thought she'd find a frail old woman, timid, confused, ready to be scared into compliance by legal jargon and heavy letterhead. Mrs. Harrington, she said, voice firm, this is a serious matter. Your son believes you may have made certain decisions under duress, or perhaps with diminished capacity. We're prepared to petition for a competency hearing if necessary. The words lit a slow, hot anger in my chest. Diminished capacity. I almost laughed. I'd like to see them try to prove that. Ms. Moore, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the quickening of my heartbeat, my mind is perfectly sound. My attorney has extensive documentation proving my mental competence, evaluations from multiple doctors. Now, if you have papers to serve, please leave them. Otherwise, I have a garden to tend to. She hesitated, clearly unprepared for resistance that didn't tremble. Finally, she slipped a thick envelope from her portfolio and handed it to me. Your son cares about you, Mrs. Harrington. He's concerned for your well-being. I took the envelope in my dirt-streaked hands. Is that so? Then he has a very interesting way of showing it. She left without another word. The moment she was gone, I called Harriet. They're claiming diminished capacity, I told her. Harriet sounded more irritated than alarmed when I explained the situation. Predictable, she said, and easy to dismantle. We have your full medical records, plus Dr. Matthews' assessment. Remember, he specifically evaluated your competence before we created the trust. Don't worry, Velma. This is desperation, and desperation usually backfires. She was right. 2 weeks later, I sat in Harriet's office, listening as she informed me that Lawson and Associates had quietly withdrawn their petition after reviewing our evidence. What now? I asked. The victory felt strangely hollow. Harriet leaned forward, her expression soft. Now, they'll try something else. People like Keith and Amara, they don't let go easily when money is involved. And she was right again. The new tactic was family pressure. The phone began ringing more than usual. Not friends, relatives I barely spoke to. Relatives I barely. 2 of Keith's cousins, a couple of distant in-laws, even Robert's sister Mildred, whom I hadn't seen in years. How could you do this to your own son? Mildred demanded the moment I answered. Keith told me everything. He says you've turned against him, punishing him for trying to help. Did he tell you, I asked quietly, that he and Amara tried to trick me into signing away my house while I was recovering from surgery? He said you misunderstood, she replied quickly. He was trying to protect your assets. From who? I asked, because it certainly wasn't from himself and Amara. The conversation unraveled from there, ending with Mildred spitting that Robert, my late husband, would be ashamed of me. That cut deeper than I wanted to admit. The calls kept coming, each carrying the same tone, the same accusations. Clearly, Keith had been busy rewriting the story, casting himself as the devoted son, me as the paranoid, ungrateful mother. One evening, after a particularly bitter call from Robert's brother, I sat on my porch, staring blankly at the sunset. Dorothy arrived quietly, settling into the rocking chair beside me. They're trying to isolate you, she said, her voice certain, make you feel like you're the villain, so you'll give in. I nodded, too drained to speak. Don't let them, she continued firmly. You know the truth, I know the truth, and deep down, Keith knows it too. A week later, while grocery shopping, I ran into Mary Peterson. Her daughter had been friends with Keith in high school. She hugged me gently. Velma, how are you feeling after your surgery? Much better, thank you, I said, genuinely glad to see her. I saw Keith last weekend, she said casually. He seemed different, stressed. She leaned in, lowering her voice. Between us, he's been asking around about refinancing options. Apparently, they're having serious money problems. That caught me off guard. I'm sorry to hear that. Mary shrugged. Amara quit her job at the design firm months ago. Rumor is they've been living on credit cards. That big house of theirs might be more for show than anything else. The information left a sour heaviness in my stomach. So their situation was worse than I'd thought. No wonder they'd been so desperate to get my house. When I got home, I found a voicemail from Keith, the first time he'd reached out since the confrontation. "Mom," his voice sounded strained, tired. "We need to talk. Not about the house or money, just please call me back." My finger hovered over the call button. For a moment, instinct stirred, the lifelong pull to go to my son, to help him. But then I remembered the cold calculation in his eyes as Amara had tried to get me to sign those papers. I didn't call back. 2 days later, a letter arrived. Not from a lawyer, Keith's handwriting on plain paper. "Mom, I know you probably hate me right now, and maybe I deserve it. Things with Amara have gotten complicated. I need your advice, not your money, just a conversation. Please." I folded the letter carefully and placed it in my desk drawer. Part of me wanted to believe him, to rush in like I always had, but another part, the wiser, newly self-protective part, suspected this was just another tactic. That evening, as I watered my roses, I noticed a familiar car parked down the street. Keith's. He didn't come up to the house. He just sat there watching. After an hour, he drove away. The next morning, Dorothy called. "Did you hear? Keith moved out of their house. Amara's telling everyone it's temporary, but Helen's daughter works at..." The bank had called to say they'd missed 3 mortgage payments. That news alone should have brought me a grim sense of justice. Wasn't this exactly the outcome they'd brought upon themselves, the downfall they had earned? But instead of satisfaction, a heavy ache settled in my chest. An ache for the little boy who used to run through the yard with fistfuls of dandelions, grinning as if he were giving me gold. Now that boy was gone. In his place stood a man so far off course that I could hardly see the path back for him. I found myself wondering again where exactly I had failed. Autumn arrived draped in fire, crimson leaves, burnt orange light, and mornings so crisp they almost stung the skin. It had been 3 months since that confrontation with Keith and Amara. 3 months since the surgery. 3 months of mending not just my body, but the deep wounds my own son had carved into my heart. I was out in the yard pruning the rose bushes, readying them for winter, when Dorothy came hurrying across our shared property line. Her cheeks were flushed from the chill air, and in her hand she clutched a folded newspaper. "Have you seen this?" she asked, a little out of breath. I set down my garden shears and took the paper she pressed toward me. The real estate section was already open to a listing I recognized instantly. Keith and Amara's Grand Colonial, manicured lawn, symmetrical windows, a facade that seemed built to impress strangers but never to welcome them, was for sale. In bold red letters across the page, foreclosure. "Helen says the bank wouldn't make a deal with them," Dorothy explained. "Amara's moved in with her parents in Connecticut." I stared at the photo, my eyes tracing the lines of the house, the perfect grass, the shadows of trees. How much of their lives, of their marriage, had been poured into keeping up this illusion of success? "And Keith?" I asked, forcing my voice to stay neutral. Dorothy hesitated. "No one really knows. Rumor is he's staying over at the Holiday Inn on Route 9. I folded the newspaper carefully as if it might shatter and handed it back to her. "Thank you for telling me." That night, I sat on the porch, watching the sunset bleed into the horizon. My thoughts spun like leaves caught in a gust. Keith was still my son, still the boy I had raised alone, still the child I had given up so much for. Could I just sit here and let him drown? But another voice, one I'd only recently begun to trust, spoke up inside me. Love without boundaries isn't love at all. It's surrender. And I had surrendered for far too long. The next morning, I made a decision. I wouldn't call Keith. I wouldn't offer to help. But if he came to me, truly came of his own accord, I wouldn't shut the door in his face. It had to be his choice to face what he had done, not another rescue mission from his mother. 2 weeks later, a foreclosure sign appeared on the lawn of the big colonial. The neighbors whispered. My phone stayed silent. Then one Saturday afternoon, while I was in the kitchen baking bread, a small joy I'd returned to during my recovery, there was a knock at the door. Not the kind of impatient, entitled knock that used to accompany Keith letting himself in with a spare key, but a hesitant, almost fragile knock. I wiped the flour from my hands and opened the door. Keith stood there. He was thinner. His skin was pale, shadows pooled under his eyes. His clothes were wrinkled, his hair unkempt. The careful, polished image Amara had sculpted was gone. What was left was a man who looked alarmingly like his father during our hardest years. "Mom," he said simply. I didn't rush forward. I didn't pull him into an embrace. I just stood there looking at him, really seeing him for the first time in years. "May I come in?" His voice was rough. I stepped aside. He walked in slowly, awkwardly, like he wasn't sure he belonged anymore. He lowered himself onto the edge of the sofa, the same place he'd sat months ago when our world cracked open. "Would you like some tea?" I asked, keeping my tone calm, though my heart was unsteady. "Yes, please," he said, and there was relief in his voice at the normalcy of the offer. In the kitchen, I let the motions steady me, warming the teapot, measuring out the leaves, setting cookies on a plate. When I returned, Keith was looking at the photo on the mantel from his high school graduation. "I was happy then," he said softly as I placed the tray down. "We both were." "Yes," I agreed, pouring tea into 2 cups. "We were." Silence stretched out between us, thick with years of unsaid words. Finally, Keith spoke. "I'm sorry, Mom." His gaze didn't waver. "Not just for the papers, the trust, and everything after your surgery, for all of it, for who I became." I sat still, listening, sifting through his words for any trace of manipulation. All I found was weariness. And maybe something like genuine regret. "Amara left," he said after a moment, "when the foreclosure became final. She told me she didn't sign up for this, packed up and went back to her parents." "I heard," I said quietly. He gave a hollow little laugh. "Of course you did. Small town." He raked a hand through his messy hair. "I've been at the Holiday Inn. Lost my job last week. Turns out showing up late looking like this," he gestured to himself, "isn't great for client relations." "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, and I meant it. "Don't be," he said, surprising me. "I needed this. All of it." His eyes moved slowly around the living room, taking in the modest furniture Amara had always ridiculed. "I lost myself, Mom, somewhere between wanting more and never being satisfied with what I already had." I took a sip of tea, letting him keep going. "The thing is," his voice was almost a whisper, "I don't know how to find my way back." For the first time since he walked in, I saw my Keith, not the man in expensive suits, not the cold, calculating son who tried to take my home, but the boy who once had a good and unguarded heart. "The way back starts with honesty," I told him. "Not just with me, with yourself." He nodded slowly. "I've been thinking a lot about that, about who I've been, what I've done, especially to you. The worst part is, I knew it was wrong, every single step, but I kept going." "Why?" I asked, the question that had burned in me for years. "Because it was easier," he said without hesitation. "Easier than standing up to Amara. Easier than admitting we built a life we couldn't afford. Easier than facing the fact I'd become someone I didn't even respect." He set his teacup down, his hand trembling slightly. "I'm not asking for money, Mom, or to move in. I needed you to know that I understand what I did, and that I'm sorry, really sorry." I made my choice in that moment, not from guilt, not from the old habit of rescuing him, but from the quiet strength I'd gathered these past months. "The guest room is open," I said evenly. "You can stay for 2 months. No rent, but you'll help with the house and the yard, and you'll look for work every single day. After 2 months, when you find a job, we can talk about a fair rent while you work on getting back on your feet." Keith's eyes widened as if I'd just handed him something he didn't expect to receive. "Mom, you don't have to do that." "I know I don't have to," I cut in before he could say more. "I'm choosing to, but this time there are boundaries, real ones. If you cross them, if you lie to me or try to manipulate me in any way, you'll be out that same day, no exceptions." He nodded slowly and I could see it happening, understanding slowly settling into his expression, replacing the initial surprise. "Thank you," he said quietly. Don't thank me yet, I replied with a small smile tugging at my lips. Wait until you see the list of repairs I've been saving up for the past year. A faint, tentative smile broke through on his face. Not the polished, practiced grin he'd once used to charm clients, but something real, almost shy. It reminded me of the boy he used to be, long before everything got complicated. That was 6 months ago. Today, I'm turning 71. For the first time in years, my house feels warm. Not just physically, but in the kind of way that sinks into your bones and makes you feel safe. Keith now has a steady job at a small accounting firm in town and has moved into his own apartment. Still, he comes over for dinner twice a week. He's quieter these days, more reflective, still piecing himself back together after shedding Amara's shadow from his life. Dorothy and her husband are here, along with a handful of friends I've slowly reconnected with over time. Even Harriet showed up, bringing a bottle of ridiculously expensive wine and cracking her dry legal jokes that make the whole room groan. There's no trace of Amara. Last I heard, she remarried quickly, another man with a beautiful home and a well-padded bank account. I hope for his sake his luck turns out better than my son's did. Keith emerges from the kitchen, holding the cake he baked himself. It's leaning slightly to one side, far from perfect, but every bit of it radiates genuine effort. As he sets it down, I look around at the people gathered here, people who care about me for who I am, not for what I own or what I can offer. Make a wish, Mom, Keith says as he lights the candles. I close my eyes, but I don't wish for anything. There's nothing left to want. Everything I truly need is right here. A home that's finally and completely mine. A son making his way back toward honesty and the quiet, steady strength I discovered in myself when I finally stood firm. Some lessons come to you later in life, but as I open my eyes to see the warm, genuine smiles surrounding me, I know the timing doesn't make them any less valuable.